Is Vladimir Putin leading the world into another conflict? Has Putin simply lost the plot? Does Putin have simply no regard for civilian lives? Is Putin the villain of this Ukraine war, or is he being unfairly demonized? What is Vladimir Putin's endgame? Joining me now are three close Russia watchers. Robert Legbold is political analyst based in Boston, United States. Madhavan Palat is probably the country's leading expert on Russian history, been tracking it for years. Happy Moon Jacob is a JNU professor and columnist. Appreciate all three of you joining us. Let me come to you, Dr. Palat, because you've tracked Russia for years. Locate Vladimir Putin for our Indian viewers today. How do you see him? Is he trying to, does he have this czarist ambition, as he's accused of an expansionist Russia returning to a pre-Cold War era? How do you see Putin?
He is hardly expanding Russia to the pre-Cold War era, and certainly not a czarist ambition or anything of that kind. He has made it clear from the beginning that NATO shall not approach Russia's borders. And to prevent that happening, he's ensuring that Ukraine is blocked, just as he had earlier ensured that Georgia does not enter NATO. So it is not necessarily an expansionist design of that kind, of the manner in which it is suggested. It is to ensure that the Soviet area should remain free of Western control or Western hegemony. That is the main idea. About further expansion, there is no indication.
Okay.
Earlier, Russian empires and so on expanded deep into Europe, as did the Soviet Union. Of that, I do not see any ambition on his part. This is for the protection of Russia alone.
You see it as a much more limited ambition. Robert Legbold, how do you see it? Do you see Vladimir Putin as simply someone who's a strongman nationalist, desperate to restore Russian power, at least in its sphere of influence? Is that what is driving him at the moment?
Well, that's certainly one of the key elements of his behavior. I think it's a slightly larger picture than what has just been said. I agree that the primary driving factor has been this determination, frustration, anger to block NATO's further encroachment on toward the Russian borders. But that in turn is part of a still larger picture. Putin, former KGB guy who spent a whole career learning how to be and how to deal with suspicion of NATO and the West and its purposes, beginning in 2004, particularly around the Beslan tragedy, around the school, then the Orange Revolutions, the Color Revolution, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, then the speech that you quoted in their earlier presentation in 2005 about the collapse of the Soviet Union being the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, was now beginning to formulate a notion that indeed the West, led by the United States, was determined, if not to destroy Russia, then certainly to limit its power, diminish its role in international politics, put Russia under the thumb of the West, and force it into, at best, a kind of deferential foreign policy toward West, led by the United States. It's in this context, then, that the issue of NATO enlargement is seen as the single most important element of that Western threat. And that has then continued to intensify. We saw it through the Georgian War in 2008, which also had an anti-NATO component to it. And now Ukraine gets dragged into it because it's the last and largest piece.
Right.
And in the evolution of his thinking, I think what is new in the last several years is a readiness to deny the very right to exist for Ukraine as a separate state. So that's where we are now. The last thing I would say in terms of your specific question, it's not that he wants to recreate the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. And as your previous speaker said, it's not an ambition for massive expansion. But I think he is now at a stage where he does want to, when he can and when he's forced by circumstance, to add pieces back to Russia. He's done it in Crimea, and I think we're going to see annexation coming out of the Ukrainian war with at least parts of the Ukraine.
Happy Moon Jacob, you know, is this therefore purely geostrategic objectives, or is there a Vladimir Putin who is a despotic leader who believes, in a sense, in his own, that his moment has come, that he will restore Russia's glory? I come back to it. Is this purely limited geostrategic objectives in Ukraine? Or is there a larger objective of going down in history as a leader who's restoring Russian pride?
Clearly, no one knows what is inside Putin's mind, but I think this is perhaps a mix of several things. Clearly, there is the geopolitical ambition, there is the legitimate geopolitical concern, as Professor Madhavan Pallad pointed out. There is, of course, the desire to sort of bring back the glory of the sort of lost glory of the Russian Empire. There is a personal ambition of the man has ruled Russia for 22 years, and he wants to be seen as continuing in power as a strong leader. So I think there is the personal, there is the political, there is the geopolitical, all of that rolled into one. But as far as the moment is concerned, I think he is perhaps taking advantage of the weakening of the US-led international system, as it were. You saw the Americans withdraw from Afghanistan. This was quite an inglorious withdrawal from Afghanistan. You saw China as the rising power, which is close to the Russian Federation. So he thought perhaps that the West is not united enough. NATO is probably not going to come into Ukraine, which it is not in any case. So there was the opportune moment in Putin's mind to sort of carry out this war against Ukraine,
right?
Which in my mind has probably not gone all that well as he may have imagined when he sort of undertook this adventure, as it were.
I want to explore his mind, and therefore I spoke this past weekend to Garry Kasparov. Garry Kasparov, chess legend, is among the leading Russian dissidents. And listen in to Kasparov, who is scathing in his indictment of Putin. And then I'll come back to my panel. Listen in. Today, turn around and tell the world, I told you so. Because I remember in your book 2014, The Winter is Coming, you had warned of the dangers of Vladimir Putin, his autocratic behavior, his dictatorial attitude, you said, to the free world. Is that how you feel today, that what has happened in Ukraine was inevitable, given the kind of person you believe Vladimir Putin is?
This is not the moment where I'd like to celebrate my prescient forecast about Putin's war. I think it could be avoided if the free world was listening, not just to me, but to Putin himself. Because Putin was quite open by declaring his plans, his visions, his strategy. Back in 2007, in February, at Munich Security Conference, he talked about the world that should return to the spheres of influence. He always wanted the world to be divided in the fashion of the past, where the big countries dictated the smaller countries how to behave, how to run their affairs. And as for his latest war against Ukraine, he has been preparing this war in plain sight. This is not, hiding in the bushes, bringing secretly troops. He even brought his Pacific fleet to the Black Sea. So he has surrounded Ukraine from all the directions. And I was shocked that the free world kept negotiating with Putin, ignoring his preparations. And also, one of the defining traits of Putin's character is lying. He has a long record of lying and eventually, turning everything, back and forth to his advantage. And it was utterly stupid not to recognize his intentions towards Ukraine, because he never recognized Ukraine as an independent state. And for many years, Russian propaganda on 24/7 has been denying Ukraine's existence. So I think the attack was very natural. But what is happening now is definitely not going according to his plan, because he failed to take over Kyiv within 2 or 3 days as he planned, and heroic defense of Ukrainians is threatening very much Putin's image of an invincible leader.
When I read your tweets over the last few days, I sense anger in them. You seem to be angry, outraged at the manner in which Putin is being allowed to get away with this invasion. I look at one of them where you say sarcastically, bravo, NATO leaders have all the weapons and no courage, and Zelensky has courage and not enough
weapons. There are no more Churchills in the halls of power, just salesmen and bureaucrats hoping to shuffle papers and avoid meaningful decisions until they leave office. Ukraine has exposed them all, cowering before a thug like Putin. Never again, today, right now. So would I be right to say this is angry? This is an angry Garry Kasparov, angry at the way the so-called free world has dealt with Vladimir Putin?
Absolutely. I'm angry, and in some of my interviews, I was asked by Dutch and German journalists about my anger. And I said, look, people are being killed. And one of the reasons that you guys, for many years, ignored these warnings, and you were doing business with Putin as usual. We all learned about appeasement in the 30s, and about Brits and French didn't want to actually to start confrontation with Nazi Germany, and they let Hitler, just to grow and to become a real menace for the world. But we can always give an excuse to Chamberlain and Daladier because they were not doing business with Hitler. The problem of Europe today is that so many politicians in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Britain, they want directly or indirectly connected to Putin's business interests. Many European politicians like Gerhard Schröder, retired politicians, top politicians, recently François Fillon, former Prime Minister of France, they didn't see anything wrong by serving Putin being on his payroll. So it's a war of Europe's doing, because they have been helping Putin to grow to the level where he believed that he was absolutely invincible and emboldened to attack Ukraine. And also Putin believed that he could do this the same way as he did Crimea annexation 8 years ago. I think he's shocked now to see that Europe eventually is getting its act together. America is also joining, and there's the united front of almost all the nations to oppose this aggression. Because people understand this is not about Putin and Ukraine. This is about the global wealth infrastructure of security infrastructure. And if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, next China, Taiwan.
Putin is a liar. He's being linked to a Hitlerian approach of the 21st century. Professor Palat, do you think Garry Kasparov has a point? This he portrays Putin as a demonic figure, destroying all opposition, doesn't listen to anyone, is his own echo chamber. Do you agree with that?
No, not at all. I obviously sympathize with the fact that with the position of the Ukrainians. It's if your country is invaded, naturally you are outraged and you naturally fight against it. That's one point. But the whole question of Putin being a demonic figure, a dictator, and so on is completely irrelevant. This has nothing to do with democracy and dictatorship. It is about powers fighting with each other to assert their domination or to protect themselves, as the case may be. So keep democracy out of it. And keep the question of big power bullying a small power. That is also irrelevant, because big powers always bully the smaller ones. The example of the Western democracies and the American democracy in the whole of the Middle East is a good example. They're perpetually bullying, perpetually invading, and so on. So these are all irrelevant issues. What Putin wants is to ensure that NATO doesn't approach Russia, plain and simple. And if the Western powers are constantly, not Western powers really, only America, the rest are all satellites to America, are enticing Ukraine constantly into the European Union and into NATO, despite all the objections that Russia has raised, and against the very promises that had been given to Gorbachev at the time of the end of the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, that NATO would not be installed in all these countries. But that's exactly what is done. Now it's going further into Ukraine. That is all.
You're saying
Putin is taking care.
No, so
this does not approach them.
So you don't believe, am I correct, Professor Palat? You don't believe in those who say that Vladimir Putin is at the moment delusional? He has these delusions of grandeur. You don't agree with that argument, right?
Oh no.
There is a pragmatic.
It's nothing to do with delusion. Of course,
there is a pragmatic ex-KGB man at work here.
Certainly he is. He's been there 22 years. He's hardly delusional. He is in charge of that, and he knows what is possible and what is not possible. And for so long, he's held his hand. Now he thinks he's got a chance. Of course, he's taking a big risk. He's playing. And he might come a cropper. That can very well happen. But many leaders do precisely that. They do take the risks. And he's taking a very big risk.
And you think he enjoys...
He might win this war.
And you think he
but
enjoys...
he may not win in the long term.
And you think he enjoys, Professor Palat, the support of the majority of Russians? Do you believe he enjoys the support of the majority of Russians?
I think so. I think he does.
Okay, let me take that to Robert.
In this case also, in the case of the invasion. Of course, they are very upset and confused about the actual military action. But generally that Russia is asserting itself against America. That's how it is. It is not Ukraine that they are bothered about. Is that Russia is asserting itself against America, which is trying to drag Ukraine into the Western alliance. For that reason, there is support, and that is calculated.
Robert Legwall, do you agree with that? That he enjoys a wide range of support in Russia? Are the likes of Garry Kasparov marginal? We've seen for the first time dissenting voices in the streets in Russia. More than 1,000 people have been arrested, which is very different from what happened in 2014 in Crimea.
Well, basically the population in general is tolerating what's going on. This is not something that they see as heroic, where they're really rallying to the leadership and applauding the war. As Professor Parat said, they are shocked and they are nervous about what's happening. But up to this point, they're responding to the only news that they get, which is primarily through television. And therefore, they are in this sort of suspended position, which is basically tolerant. Within the elite, including the business community who are better informed, they are not only shocked, they are very much in opposition to what's going on. And as a very specific illustration that's relevant to my field, which is academic, in the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, which is the largest Russian university that trains people for public affairs, particularly the Foreign Service and the like, 800 students, alumni and staff, 800, have signed a letter, or a petition, which is sharply critical of the war, sympathetic to their Ukrainian brothers and sisters, and there's going to be more of that. We've had it at the individual level. Putin's press spokesman, Peskov's daughter, has done an Instagram condemning the war, immediately taken down. 7 of the oligarchs have now spoken against it, and quite sharply, as something that is damaging Russia. So I think the real question is, as this war drags on, and we now are in the second phase where there are going to be large-scale casualties. You've been reporting it in the first part of your program in Kharkiv. You know what that's going to lead to. Something similar, maybe worse in Kiev, is going to occur in other cities. And they're not going to, at the center, be able to control the information. And then they're going to have a fundamental problem when the general public that has been tolerant, has listened to the only news they've had, suddenly realize they've been lied to. That creates a very different relationship between society and government.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned the oligarchs, because there are those who will believe, Robert Legwall, that they've sort of, in a way, been the key to Putin's dominance, that the financial power that they have in Russia, promoted by Putin, has been the reason for what the West calls a kleptocracy. But do you believe that if the oligarchs break away, as some of them are, that could be end game for Mr. Putin? Is that what you're suggesting, Mr. Legwall?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure where it goes. Up to this point, in the context of Crimea, and after that, as Putin reinforced his power, strengthened his political hand, and in the face of Western sanctions, most of these oligarchs fell into place, fell behind Putin, not the least because he was then bailing them out from the effects of Western sanctions. But the level of sanctions in this context, and what I believe is the miscalculation that Putin has made in launching this war, now is creating a different attitude among them. What they will do, and what Putin will do in trying to corral them and control them and limit any opposition they raise, I don't know. none of us understands at this stage what the nature of the political game is in Moscow. The only thing we can say is that there's only one man in charge at this point, and there's no element, including his closest circle, capable of influencing him. But what dynamic that creates then at various levels at the top among these elites, I think is unpredictable and certainly for me unknown at this point.
Happy Moon Jacob, do you see the possibility, the real possibility of a challenge to Vladimir Putin if this war doesn't go the exact way he wants, if the casualties rise? This is someone who's attacked civilian areas in the past, whether it's been in Aleppo during the war in Syria, it could happen in Kiev and Kharkiv. If those numbers go up, if there's international ostracism of Russia, will Vladimir Putin be cornered? Do you see a cornered Vladimir Putin where there could be voices within Russia that could challenge him?
I think this is still very early to sort of predict whether this is going to go down that way. But what is very clear at this point of time is that things are not going according to Putin's initial plans. Let's look at some of the facts. To begin with, I think, as somebody pointed out earlier, Putin was probably hoping for an early victory in Ukraine. That hasn't happened yet. You're looking at the Ukrainians holding out. It is true that the Russia probably has not brought in the main armored formations or the hundreds of combat aircraft that the Russians have. They haven't sort of brought that into sort of establishing air superiority over Ukraine, but the Ukrainian resistance is far fiercer than I think Putin had anticipated. The Ukraine's army is fighting back, even though it is a much inferior army, along with the population that is standing by the Ukrainian leader, as it were. And as you pointed out, there is the united international reaction to Putin's adventure in Ukraine.
No, but if it doesn't go, if it doesn't go the way he wants, given his past record, do you see him, as some people in the West fear, that he could go out of control?
Now, I don't think that is, a lot of people sort of tend to make out, make too much out of the personality traits of Mr. Putin, that he's a dictator, he's ruthless, he's villain. He may be all of that. I have no issues with that. But I think that's not how you sort of should analyze a strategic situation which is unfolding. I think he's a rational actor, and he's probably, as Professor Parad pointed out, taking rational actions based on very clear interests that he sees in the neighborhood. So I don't think the irrationality sort of weighing on him and him, trying to use tactical nuclear weapons, or because he sort of raised the alert levels of nuclear alert levels have been increased. So I don't think that is how it is going to go down. What is likely to happen clearly is that with no clear victory for Russia in Ukraine, you're looking at Ukrainian suffering in the longer term if this sort of war continues. And this also could become very costly for Putin internally. The more the war lasts, I think it is going to be difficult for the Russian people to support Putin's adventure in Ukraine. So therefore, you may see a small circle developing within Russia who may turn against him. But I think this is all in the realm of speculation. But this is not going to be easy for him. That's very clear.
One very final quick word from you, Professor Palad. What will Vladimir Putin's legacy be? Will it be shaped by what happens over the next few weeks in Ukraine, or has that been established? How do you locate Vladimir Putin for us in the Russian context? What do you see his legacy at the moment then?
Well, his legacy will first of all be that he has re-established the Russian state, which Yeltsin had made such effort to dismantle practically, that he has reasserted Russian power, that he has at least posed a challenge to America in a way that has never happened, that has not happened under Yeltsin, that he has restored his good relations with China, which is an important point, and retained the friendship of India simultaneously. So if he pulls this off, it'll be a great legacy. But it'll be a very tough one to pull off, because in the short term he is likely to win. He must win, because Ukraine cannot stand against him at all. don't let us rush to judgments merely because the 7 days and he hasn't had an easy victory. You never have easy victories, even in however powerful you are in a matter of 7 days.
Okay.
So you have to wait for some more time for that. And he clearly does not want to attack the civilian population. He's not bombing the cities or any such thing. He's encircling them. He's waiting for a surrender, a negotiation, and so on. You must remember that Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. So the relation between Russia and the Ukraine is very intimate. It is not a matter of just bombing an enemy, as you did during the Second World War, the combatants did.
Right.
So it's not a simple, straightforward matter of that kind.
Let me leave it there.
So the point is,
I've run completely out
after
of...
that, what happens in the long term?
Right. Well,
Okay.
well, we'll see what happens in the long term. But clearly, in the short term, Vladimir Putin is at the center of what's happening, and his personality, in a way, could well shape his politics as well when it comes to how he pursues his end game here. Thank you all very much for giving us that deep dive into the life and times of Vladimir Putin.